Good evening and welcome to Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades. I'm your host, Joshua Solomon. Tonight, we have Representative Jim Kofalt joining us this evening. JP is out. He's celebrating his wife Donna's birthday. Happy birthday, Donna. You guys went to lunch at my favorite restaurant today, and you didn't invite me. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. As always, Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades is sponsored by Wilson Hill Pistol Club. 1732 Lakeshore Road, right here in Manchester. It is the oldest sports shooting club in the state of New Hampshire. You can go to wilsonhillpistol.org. You can look up and sign up for training. Right now, the only training that's on the schedule, we just had Defensive Handgun 1 on Sunday, so that's past us. This Saturday, we have Bleeding Management, and that is a closed training for a specific group, so we don't have that. The next one on this calendar is NRA Basic Pistol on Sunday, December 16th. You can go to the website, you can contact us, you can sign up and pay for training, and you can show up to the monthly membership meetings at 7 o'clock on the first Wednesday of every month. That is that. So, Jim, how have you been? It's been a few weeks. Hasn't been too long.
Hasn't been too long, but feels a lot has happened since we last spoke.
So many things have happened, both locally and nationally and whatnot. The one thing that I've been wanting to talk about is Veto Day.
Okay.
Just because every representative comes through, and we talk about their bills and whatnot, and I know Veto Day has passed since the last time I talked to a state rep, so I know not much what has happened, but we've talked about it on the show, so I just want to kind of give an update what happened.
Okay, yeah. So there were 4 bills. One of them was kind of an easy veto because circumstances had changed around this eating disorders hotline, and we had a bill to put that on the back of these ID cards, and so that one was vetoed because it no longer made sense to do it. That was easy. The 2 bills that really got considerable discussion in the House, one was the Burgess biomass power plant up north. The state has been subsidizing that for many years. In fact, the ratepayers have been subsidizing that for many years.
Right.
It did pass the House and the Senate. The governor thankfully vetoed that bill. We sustained the veto in both the House we sustained the veto in the House, so it didn't have to go to the Senate. The other one that was under discussion a lot, and I may have the number wrong, but I want to say it's House Bill 377, but it had to do with some additional requirements, some notice requirements for the Office of Professional Licensure and Certification, so OPLC, because there are people in various professions who were unhappy with kind of the timing of certain hearings and meetings and some changes that were coming that affected pharmacists or hairstylists or other people who are subject to licensure in New Hampshire. And they said, well, we want to kind of force them to be more transparent, to give longer notice. The governor vetoed that because it would have subjected OPLC to different requirements than every other agency in the state. And so that was overridden in the House, but it was sustained by the Senate. So the governor, went.
Well, that one's interesting to me because we were talking about the whole licensing thing earlier. Right, that was one of the big things that was happening this year was trying to reduce that agency, reduce the number of boards, commissions that oversee licensing in New Hampshire, and maybe take licensing away from certain professions, certain
basically
low-level
to
types.
Deregulate a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we were doing that, and so what you're saying is this particular bill was. Because the reason it was introduced is because some of these licensing boards were upset about the timing of meetings, or
it's more that the licensees, so I heard from pharmacists, for example, who felt like they were handed last minute changes that kind of showed up out of the blue. they had very little time to respond or even to provide public comment.
I gotcha.
And they suddenly had to, and the complaint is, well, look, I'm trying to run a business here. I've got a job to do. And when you send these fairly significant changes my way, I'd like to have time to offer input into that
Right.
decision-making process, and I don't. So this was intended to rectify that situation. So hopefully we will see some additional transparency there. Legislation has a tendency to do that sometimes. Even if it doesn't pass, it creates some pressure or awareness that
Right.
maybe we ought to.
Right, even if something
do things a
doesn't
little
pass,
differently.
it
Yeah.
starts a discussion.
Yep.
And unfortunately, sometimes that's what you have to do. You have to
Right.
introduce something knowing full well that there's no way you're going to get the votes to get this thing through.
Mm-hmm.
But you want a discussion at the government level, the legislative level. You want media attention. You want newspapers,
Yep.
right? And you want people to start talking about it.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's a lot of where a lot of government waste goes, right?
Yeah.
That's a wasted. That's where time. It's a time sink, but sometimes it has to happen.
Well, I had a bill like that last year, and it was that I had introduced, and it was. I actually would have liked it to pass, but I was comfortable with it just getting as far as it did. I filed a bill that would have prohibited schools from holding vaccine clinics during school hours. And the problem I saw was I knew of at least 2 cases in New Hampshire and 1 in Vermont where a child was vaccinated not just without parental consent, but explicitly
Against.
contrary to parental consent. In fact, I came in with a permission form that said, no, I do not consent all over it. And I said, this is what this particular child brought to school that day. She got the flu vaccine,
But
6 or
of
7-year-old
course,
child.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but the point there being is if you hold the clinic during the school day, then each classroom, is called down to the gymnasium or wherever it is that they're going to do that, and they call them a classroom at a time, and they just assume that every child that shows up gets the vaccine. Or
Well,
and they don't.
and then there was a
Yeah.
case in Vermont where
Whereas if you hold it outside of school hours, then the parents who want their kids vaccinated can show up to have it done.
Right. This would have also required a parent to be present.
Right.
So there was a case
Which should be the case when any type of medical operation is taking place. A guardian or someone medically responsible for that child, for that minor, should be present when any of those things are being taken place.
Yeah.
That's what I feel.
So this happened in Nashua. It happened in Rochester. Those were both flu vaccine cases.
Of course, it happened in larger cities.
In Brattleboro, Vermont, last December, I think, it was the COVID vaccine with a 7-year-old boy whose first name had the same first name as another kid in the class, and it was sort of an unusual first name.
Oh, really?
And he came home with somebody else's name tag and somebody else's vaccine card and a bandage on his shoulder. So that family took that to court. They sued. But what they learned in the process is that in the state of Vermont, the schools are incentivized. If you hit a certain percentage of vaccination, you're going to get funding.
Yeah.
So
Well, we talked about that as well. There were huge billion-dollar incentives put out by the government for the COVID vaccine specifically during this whole push, and so when you were being counseled by your doctor on whether or not to receive the COVID vaccine, the doctor was being pressured by his employers,
Right.
And of course doctors aren't self-employed. This whole self-employed, personal practice thing is a very rare thing in the medical world nowadays.
Right.
And so most of them work for these larger systems, right? We have, the 2 big ones here are in this area are Elliott and Dartmouth, right? And so these larger systems, they're getting pushed and they're getting kickbacks from companies like Pfizer for their percentages, right? And so your advice that you're getting from your doctor on these experimental vaccines is not on the full up and up, right? There is pressure from above, even though an individual doctor or an individual practice say, "Whoa, we're not getting kickbacks." Well, it's happening at the insurance company level is where it's happening, and that is the part that just kills me with any type of vaccine process. Is the money involved at the upper echelons that we don't have visibility into, and we're supposed to be ignoring.
Yep. Yep.
So I apologize. I kind of went off on a tangent. Because especially since now in the last 3 or 4 months we've got these studies coming out. The Pfizer misrepresented to the government what was in the vaccines. So when a pharmaceutical company like that creates a vaccine, they have the laboratory where they're inventing it, right? They're testing it on rats and mice and all of this stuff, and they're inventing the vaccine, and it's a very controlled environment. And then they take that very controlled environment, and you have to expand on it, right? You can't just make one vial. You have to ramp that up into a manufacturing process where you're making millions of vials. And so all of the tests and all of the approvals and all the emergency approvals were all done with these very strictly controlled laboratory samples of these vaccines. But when they went to the manufacturing process, that was where they started to do the human trials and all of that stuff, and started reporting back all of the information. And they started leaving out, well, wait a minute, these large manufactured samples were contaminated. They had contaminated DNA samples in them, right? I can't remember what the exact term was, but the bottom line is what they put out all the research papers on is all of this controlled stuff, but all of the other stuff is starting to find out that there's been contamination and DNA breakdown in some of these, and that's what the general masses have gotten. And all this business. Oh, there's no graphene in the vaccine, but in the manufacturing process, not the laboratory process, but in the manufacturing, sure enough, it's starting to show up, and that stuff is coming true now, right? These are no longer conspiracy theories. We have independent doctors, researchers, labs, universities in other countries that are doing this work and going back to everybody who's gotten the shot and taking blood samples and taking samples of their DNA and seeing that, yes, it is being altered. You've got the mRNA process that was tested in a laboratory, but it did not prove out when we went to mass production. And we're starting to see that now. And we're also starting to see that when Pfizer figured that out, they started hiding that from the government as well. So we're not allowed to know those things as well. So the whole vaccine thing and getting permission and understanding what you're getting permission for, especially when you're a school and you're giving out vaccines, COVID vaccines, flu vaccines to children, it's not that the parents are anti-vaccine, right? There's a difference between what used to be known as an anti-vax family, right, who would refuse to get vaccines of any type from birth, right, a religious exemption, etc., to what is being demonized as anti-vax now. And it's just because we now have more information publicly about what's in these things and what's in these annual vaccines that is an annual revenue stream for these pharmaceutical companies. If you stop taking your annual flu vaccine and then you don't get the flu because you've got some sort of natural immunity or you've got or you're just plain healthy, that's a revenue stream loss for these pharmaceutical companies. So when they were able to get the government to start pushing this mass, that was a huge payday for them. Anyway, I'm back off on another tangent I haven't been on in quite a while. Sorry.
That's okay. I think there's a lot of, right now, I think there's a lot of people calling for data transparency, because there's been a lot of data that's been manipulated. There's been a lot of data that's been suppressed. You know about the Pfizer wanting to suppress the trial data.
The suppression is the biggest
years.
part. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 75 years. They wanted to not release the information about what's in it.
Right. So I think those are issues. I think there are a lot of people who weren't necessarily skeptical about vaccines in the past, but they are now. And I think skepticism is a healthy thing.
Skepticism is fine, but I wouldn't. They're using the term anti-vax to demonize anyone who's now a little bit skeptical.
Well, and my position is, you should be able to decide for yourself. So I've had legislation, that takes away some of the rulemaking authority and mandates at the state level. It has not. Most of it has not passed. One did. That had to do with foster homes, and so that was a step forward. But yeah, there's an industry behind it, and I saw an article just today about, and I had talked. Peter McCullough had visited New Hampshire, and he spoke about the importance of sort of a nasal spray as a kind of a base. It's almost like hand washing. It's one of these things that, if you have a respiratory virus, one of the easiest things you can do to safeguard against that is to have some kind of a nasal spray. And so I saw an article today that reminded me of that conversation, because it was basically saying the government went after some of these companies that made nasal sprays, saying, we're prohibiting you from presenting this as something that could potentially protect against respiratory viruses. So really, it's kind of the whole ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine thing was about, we can't have and vitamin D. Studies out of, I think, Indonesia, studies out of Asia, certainly. Vitamin D was a it certainly strongly diminished the effects of COVID, and the likelihood of getting COVID. And so any of these sort of cheap and easy remedies or preventative measures had to be suppressed, because we got to sell more vaccines.
Right.
So it really, and on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine in particular, they needed the emergency use authorization, and they weren't going to be able to get it if we had
an alternative,
a reasonable solution to the problem.
Yep.
So it's really, I think that the longer time marches on, the more will be exposed on just how diabolical this whole thing has been.
Yeah.
It's pretty bad.
All of that information, what really burns me is that all of that information about ivermectin and hydrochloroquine came out at the very beginning. It was, people were using it in third world countries because they use those as standard meds in third world countries because they're cheap, they're easy to manufacture,
and they're safe.
And they're safe. They're almost 100% safe.
Yep.
And but they're not designer drugs. They're not expensive drugs. They're not new. They don't put money into the pockets of the pharmaceutical research companies or the legislators who mandate that you have to use those things. Yeah. But what burns me is that information about the effectiveness of both of those drugs came out before Operation Warp Speed was even finished, before the vaccine was out there and being given to us on a regular basis, right? And I can tell you from personal experience, they work. Right? I found my own source of ivermectin. I've never had a flu that's lasted more than 24 hours, even though I've been exposed over and over and over again to COVID, and I've never had a COVID vaccine. But as soon as I start feeling down, ivermectin, I'm done in a day and a half.
Yeah.
It works, and ivermectin really is a miracle drug. It's not a conspiracy theory. It was developed by a Japanese scientist back in the 60s or 70s, and it's been used as an antiparasitic, an antiviral. It's been used all over the world, and in fact, it has won a Nobel Prize in medicine for being a miracle drug, and yet you're not supposed to know about it, and you're supposed to listen to Whoopi Goldberg tell you that it's a horse dewormer.
Well, and we actually, I was a co-sponsor on Leah Cushman's bill that would have made ivermectin available essentially over the counter in New Hampshire. It would have been through what's called standing orders. And that bill passed and was vetoed by the governor, I believe. Yeah, it was. But we had Dr. Paul Merrick, who literally wrote the book on critical care. He is one of the leading experts on critical care in the country. And he ended up quitting his job at Eastern Virginia Medical Center. He ended up quitting his job because they basically said, no, you can't use ivermectin. He said, okay, but that's what saves patients.
Right.
It's part of a regimen that saves patients. So he partnered with Pierre Corey in founding the Frontline Critical Care FLCCC. I don't remember what the third C stands for, but he actually came and testified here in New Hampshire and testified on that bill. And he said all the things you said and had a lot of data to present, and we had people, other doctors, legislators, doctors would say, no, those studies don't mean anything, it's not true, it's not safe. I'm telling you, ivermectin has a safer safety profile than over-the-counter cough syrup that you can buy at CVS right now without a prescription.
Yeah,
so it's the level of manipulation. I mean, this is where, under the guise of protecting you, the government makes all kinds of decisions that are really putting their thumb on the scale of various kinds of transactions that either make people money or
well, that's what it's really what it boils down to. We've discussed it before, and we've discussed it in concept of climate change and whatnot, right? Where what you have is somebody who's invented a more super efficient solar cell, right? But he's having trouble selling it. Right? He's got a company. He's got a small company. He's got enough influence over his local congressman, right? Say, hey, can you go to Washington and introduce a bill that mandates that 25% of all new homes have to be powered by solar panels? And hey, by the way, I sell solar panels, right? And so now you get a legislature that's going to go and write up a bill. And before the bill's written up, the guy says, hey, you might want to buy stock in my company too, right? Yeah. And so bill gets written up, bill gets passed, bill gets put into law, right? So now the law says that these building contractors have to do 25% of their homes have to be, windmills or solar, you're mandating that somebody go and buy a specific product. Meanwhile, I might be, say, the Speaker of the House, and I've introduced this bill, and I'm encouraging everybody to vote for the bill, and I'm also encouraging my husband, who likes, to play with hammers at 2 a.m., to go and buy stock in a whole bunch of these companies that I'm about to mandate that the world buy from.
Yep.
And that's how Congress folks get rich,
right,
is because they know what they're about to mandate is going to create a surge in a particular market.
Yep.
And that's why they're going to trot out whatever doctors or environmental experts, or for whatever purpose they want. And the bottom line is, any scientist will produce a paper that supports whatever position the person who's paying them wants it to support.
Yep.
That's the way it works. And so that's exactly what you saw up there. You saw a couple of doctors that had integrity, understood what was going on, quit their jobs over it, and they were testifying. And then right behind them, you got a whole bunch of doctors testifying who are on the payrolls of these companies that are going to make millions of dollars over this, billions of dollars over this. And that's how it's worked. That's how it's worked with every industry. Electric cars, the trucking industry in California, trucking and electric cars. California, it's illegal for you as a trucking company, shipping company, to drive a truck that's older than 15 years, I think. Something of that nature. Some of these trucks are 20, 30 years old, are still in great shape because the trucking industry takes care of their vehicles. It's not like buying a Ford Escort and having it rust out in 6 years, right?
And they're diesel engines.
Right,
So
exactly. And so, but California has mandated that you can't have trucks older than such and such. So now you got a problem with the trucking industry. They can't drive their trucks in there, and so they can't get the shipments off the ports in California, right? And of course this happened. This is exactly why it happened. So now you've got ships coming in from China all over the place, sitting in the bay out there at Long Beach, because there's no way to unload them because there aren't enough trucks, because the trucks are now illegal. And it's the same. It's the same with electric vehicles. California wants to be 100% electric by what, 2035 or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? And in the meantime, all of those legislators, all of those politicians are buying stock in these electric companies, and those laws will not be repealed, because if they're repealed, they lose their nest egg.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm ranting again.
No, it's
It's all money.
It's true.
And I feel so bad because I didn't used to be this pessimistic.
Well, the country
20 years ago, I did not see these things.
Yeah.
And
Did you ever read Atlas Shrugged?
Yes.
The country is looking a whole lot
It
like
is.
Atlas Shrugged.
It really is.
And it's all sort of under the guise of saving the world and protecting people, and
yeah, you're too
doing all
stupid to
that's good
take
and
care
right.
of yourself, so we're going to do it for you.
And that's the pretense for controlling things, stacking the deck, and people getting rich. And it's at the expense of everybody else. So we see it a lot.
Yeah, and I see it more and more. I'm closer to it because I see so many of folks like you rolling through here in the studio. I get to meet you, I get to talk to you, and I get to hear what's going on up there. And then I go and I read the news stories, and so I kind of understand what's going on, and I've got an insight into it that I think a lot of politicians understand. Even if they're on the wrong side, they understand it, right? It's not that their policies aren't working. Their policies are working exactly the way they intended them to. They're just not going to say it out loud.
Right. So I'd like to actually transition that whole theme actually ties into some of what we've been discussing recently is transgender surgery on minors. And so we had some retained bills that came up in Health and Human Services this week. One was a kind of sanctuary state for people who want to get transgender surgery or perform transgender surgery. So, many of us on the Republican side of the aisle opposed that. But the other was House Bill 619, which initially was intended to do multiple things, but what it really comes down to at this point is we ought not to allow minors to have this life-altering surgery that there's a very good chance that they will regret down the road.
Yep.
If somebody has reached the age of majority and they want to do that,
Right.
I still personally I question it, but at that point, you're an adult.
Well, that's exactly what we've been saying on this show. Is that once you're an adult, it's hands off the kids. But we also, I don't have it right in front of me, but you reminded me, like you said, a high percentage are going to regret it. But I actually had the numbers. So a 6-year study was done. I don't know where. Maybe I did discuss it with you.
I don't think
but
we talked about it.
A 6-year study was done in one of the universities in England, but they asked a group of people, and not a small group of people. They asked something like 20,000 people. Okay, what is your sex? What is your gender? Are you straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual? You know, what's your preferred, right? Are you transgender? Have you been, you know, they asked all of those things. And what it turned out is about 68% changed their mind in that 6-year period, right? And that's people who were gay. There was a percentage of like 68% that changed their mind. Okay, I'm not gay. I you know, did some funny things in college and I'm over it, so I'm straight again, right? Yep. But when it came to the transgender folks, the number went up to something like 81%, right? The folks that were transgender. And so, as we know from this whole discussion, there's different levels of transgender, right? Transgender can be, okay, I'm going to dress as the opposite sex and I'm going to live my life as the opposite sex, and that's one. When you start getting surgery, you can't go back.
Right.
And that's the problem. If 79-80% of the transgender population is going to change their mind in 6 years, a percentage of those are going to get surgery and then still want to change their mind. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. Right. Not only is it a huge problem for adults, but if we allow this to take place in minors, and the minors become adults, it's over, right? Who do they blame? Who do they point to?
Right, and this is all, we're already seeing a lot of this. And I've talked to people who, they've been through this process. They deeply regret it. They feel like they've permanently altered their physiology, and they can never go back. They can never get back what they've lost. And a lot of, I mean, we've heard from proponents of transgender surgery for anybody. We've heard, well, you know, this is kind of self-policing. You know, there's a responsible approach to this. Well, I've also heard from people who've been through the process, no, they didn't counsel me on anything. They kind of sat me down and said, oh, 5 minutes, yeah, it sounds like you're, you know, we need to start giving you hormones. And that was starting down that path. So, you know, quite simply, House Bill 619, which was retained, will get a vote on January 3rd or 4th. It basically just says you can't have this this gender reassignment surgery as a minor in New Hampshire.
Surgery? What about the hormone treatments? Because that's another thing. It's not surgery, but it is permanent. You start treating a prepubescent child,
right,
male or female, with hormone therapy. Yeah. You've done permanent damage without doing surgery. You know, you've made it look simple. You've made it sound simpler. Well, they've gone in for counseling and they start taking hormones.
Right.
That's still permanent.
That is also permanent. And so there's a couple of bills that are coming up in the coming year. I have a bill that is less ambitious than House Bill 619, because 619 would ban these procedures for minors. The bill I've filed for next year would simply say that we're not going to fund transgender surgery on minors with Medicaid, because right now we do, theoretically. I don't know if I don't know how much that's happening in New Hampshire, but our state policy right now is that if a Medicaid recipient minor wants a sex change operation, they can get it paid for with Medicaid.
I don't understand.
And so
you can't let a minor smoke, get a tattoo, buy a gun, drink alcohol.
Yeah.
Why? Because their brains aren't developed enough to make those important adult decisions yet. But we're allowing this?
The other bill that
So frustrating.
The other bill in this category that I think is worth watching is J.R. Hole has filed legislation that essentially creates an extended period of liability. So, if a physician or other medical provider counsels someone, or if they end up doing surgery on a minor, or providing these life-altering hormones, there's a longer period in which that person can come back and say, you really did not, this was not the right thing for me, and I didn't go through the right counseling, and you didn't do your due diligence, and you did this anyway, and now I deeply regret it. I'm going to sue you. So that's another bill that we're going to be hearing in the coming year.
I'd like to see that extended. Make it like a 10-year peried.
Yep.
Because like I said earlier, like this, you got 80% change their mind in 6 years.
Yep.
You make it a 10-year period, and you've got a good,
Yeah. The other bill I'd love to talk about is my spelling to communicate bill, because I know you did a show on autism recently.
Yes.
And
yes.
This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. So, have you heard about spelling to communicate?
I haven't.
Okay.
I haven't. We like to. It's perfect. It's what we like to do this time of year. Thanksgiving, Christmas. We like to talk about these types of things.
Well, I got a text last year from a friend of mine who lives in town, lives in my district, and she said, "Jim, I've got to talk to you about what's going on with my daughter." Now, her daughter's 19 years old. She's autistic. She has apraxia, meaning that she has autism, and part of that manifests as an inability to speak or to reliably communicate through speech. And so she said, "I need to talk to you about my daughter." I texted back, "Well, I'm sorry you're having issues. I'll see what I can do to help." And she responded, "No, there are no problems." She said, "Miracles are happening. Absolutely unbelievable things are happening with my daughter, and I've got to tell you about it." Well, we spoke very shortly after that, and she said, I've been, I had pulled my daughter out of the school system. I was homeschooling her, and I've been using like a third grade curriculum. She said, "I realized I should be using a college curriculum. She's brilliant. She understands all these things." I said, "Well, what's going on? How'd you find this out?" Well, a friend of hers had said, there's this thing called spelling to communicate. A woman in Atlanta named Elizabeth Vossler figured out that autistic people who cannot speak don't have a cognitive impairment. They have a motor skills impairment, meaning that speech is a fine motor skill. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody doesn't have that fine motor skill, but they have gross motor skills, they may not be able to speak, but they can point to letters on a letterboard. So she has developed a method for teaching people to spell by pointing to a letterboard, and they start out with fairly large letters, and so it's a real gross motor skill, and then they graduate to a single letterboard that has the entire alphabet on one board, and a lot of these people graduate to using a keyboard. But what they're finding is that it's not just that they go from not communicating to what do you want for dinner. It's that they're getting to communicate extraordinarily complex thoughts. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So the young lady in my friend's daughter, her name is Grace. And they were going through an exercise with Grace one day, and they asked her what's called a prior knowledge question, meaning, we didn't teach you this in the lesson, but we want to see if you know it. What is the molecule through which genetic traits are passed from one generation to the next? Now, if it were me, I would have spelled out DNA. Mm-hmm. She spelled out, and I may get this wrong, deoxyribonucleic acid.
Yep.
Okay, so she spelled the whole thing. She did the same thing with ALS when she was asked, what does
Asymptotic lateral sclerosis.
yes, she spelled it all out when she was asked what ailment did Stephen Hawking suffer from, and so there are young people who were never able to speak their entire life, who are writing books now, who are writing blogs. There's a young woman who graduated valedictorian from her college in Florida. She lives in New Jersey. Never spoke. Finally learned how to communicate using an iPad keyboard, and absolutely brilliant. There's one young man who's written three or four books on Amazon, and if you go to his author page, it says, until 3 years ago, people thought that I had the intellect of a toddler, and I have learned how to communicate through spelling, and now the whole world has opened up for me. So if you can imagine that you had all the same cognitive abilities that you have right now, but from the day you were born, you were never able to speak, it would be like being locked in a prison. You never articulate what you want. You can never communicate with other people beyond just very basic things. And what this has, and if you talk to the families who have experienced this, they invariably say, I had my doubts, I've been disappointed too many times, but my friend whose son or daughter or family member has autism, they convinced me to try it, and it's completely changed our lives. So one young man who lives in New Hampshire, he was at the showing of this movie. I'll talk about the movie in a minute, but he had spelled out sort of how this is, his life is so much less stressful. He's able to, he sees a future for himself now, and his mother said, yeah, his blood pressure has dropped 40 points because he was just so wound up before, frustrated.
Well, you would be, wouldn't you?
Of course you would.
If people were talking to you like a 3-year-old and you wanted to respond like a 20-year-old,
right?
You would be, yeah.
In fact, one of the stories I heard was that one of the first things one of these young people said, he was 18 years old, Mom, can you please tell Dad to stop asking me to go potty? I'm 18 years old.
Right.
So there's a gentleman in California, his name is J.B. Handley, and his son is Jamie. His son is in his 20s, has autism, and they sort of just managed him as best they could. He couldn't speak. But they were introduced to this, and it completely, as he said, this saved our family. We had just, it was excruciating to kind of deal with what's going to happen to him when we're gone. It really took a lot out of them. So J.B. Handley and his son Jamie wrote a book together, and it's called Underestimated. And that actually became, I read the book, somebody gave me a copy, and it was a really interesting read. The last couple of chapters are all written by autistic people who have learned to communicate using this method. And then they made a movie, and the movie is called Spellers. And that was released in April. It won the Best Documentary at the Phoenix Film Festival. There have been a number of showings. There's a couple down at Nashua. Neil and Lori Rogers put on a showing down at Nashua High School. Health Freedom New Hampshire did a showing in Wilton at the Wilton Town Hall Theater. The Council on Disabilities sponsored a showing up in Concord. And this is just, it's people sharing this with other people. The problem is it's not available in the schools. And there's some kind of resistance to it. And a little bit of it is, I think, gee, I'm trained in this, so I'm trained to think that my methodology is the answer and not that. And some of it is that people have compared it to something called facilitated communication, and facilitated communication was discredited. It turned out to not be helpful. It turned out to not be real. It was people being guided really in communicating what the facilitator wanted them to communicate. And so at the end of the movie, they actually ask Jamie Handley, the young man in the family I was just talking about, what do you say to people who say, we need more studies, we need more science to prove that this is real, or that it's not real? And he types out on the keyboard, they're delusional. I'm living proof that this is, this works. And he says, if our schools understood the potential that autistic people have, they would be playing to our strengths. He said, autistic people are the great innovators of tomorrow if you can unlock that with communication. So it's just like, I just got chills when I was hearing about it for the first time. I'm kind of getting chills right now. This is life-changing stuff, but it's not available in the school. So right now, if you have somebody with special needs in the schools, they're going to get ABA therapy, or they're going to get speech and language therapy. They're going to get a certain range of methodologies. And I'm not saying anything bad about those. I think different things work for different people. But I would like to see Spellings and Communicate be available. So I've written a bill that would create a pilot program administered through the schools. It would also be available to homeschoolers or people in private schools. So
I think that would be huge for homeschoolers, because a lot of children are homeschooled if they're in that state.
Right. So the parents would be the ones who initiate the grant application, and then if they're in a public school, then the grant could be administered through the school, or it could be administered through a private organization that the DOE contracts with. So it's not terribly expensive, but my concern is, like, if we're paying for these kinds of services, we should pay for things that are effective.
Right.
And people have said that this is so effective and it's so life-changing for them. I want it to be available, and I kind of want to get the foot in the door so that the special education professionals who are sort of trained to think like, I know what works, I want them to open their minds to this. And as soon as people see this, I've heard this over and over again, the same phrase, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And in the movie, J.B. Handley goes through the whole process, and they actually show video of some of the first sessions his son had with Elizabeth Vossler learning this methodology. And for him, the light bulb went on when she had a session, and she said, well, they were talking about carnivores. She said, okay, well, what would the opposite of a carnivore be? And he spelled out herbivore. And J.B. Handley said, "Oh, excuse me, that wasn't in the lesson, was it?" And she said, "No, that's what we call a prior knowledge question." And that was the moment when the light bulb went on, and he realized there's a whole world in there, and I never knew it, and I never had access to it.
So my question, I mean, that's fascinating to me. But my question is this: for someone who had been in that state for as long as he had been, that prior knowledge question, where did he get the prior knowledge? Just staring at whatever TV that mom and dad put on for him, or reading, or
from TV, from conversations, from who knows?
But what that means is that they gained that knowledge.
Right.
I mean, how many people would say herbivore versus vegetarian? Right? You've got someone who's got a better vocabulary than a lot of the people that we meet on a daily basis.
Right, like deoxyribonucleic acid.
Exactly. Everybody would say DNA instead.
Yep.
So that means that they got this education somewhere, which is great, which means that their mind was working. It was the highest functioning part of their body throughout their entire life, and it was doing its job, right? They were. when they're learning this, like you said, they don't have the fine motor skills at the beginning, but when they're learning, when they're typing, do they end up being able to type, say, as fast as we can, or
it's more like,
or is this like
it's more like hunt and peck kind of typing. It's slower typing.
Right, but because that always fascinated me about Dr.
Stephen Hawking?
Stephen Hawking, yes. That always fascinated me about Stephen Hawking was that traditionally people in his state with ALS would die very quickly, like within a couple of years. But he had a particular form that was able to be held off for decades, thankfully for the world. But they were also able to provide him with the technology where he could communicate.
Right.
Why wasn't that? How is that different from this? Like he was able to use a computer, stare at a screen, pick letters out. What does the spellers thing do?
Well,
does it slowly graduate them to that type of level, or?
It is a slow process. So, and when I say slow, I don't mean years. I mean, it's over the course of weeks and months. They go from zero to, let's say they go from crawl to walk to eventually run. But it is a process. So there's a lot of practice. There's a lot of sort of, like anything, kind of getting stuck in the middle of a word and having to start over. So when you watch videos of it, you'll see this kind of, this frustration. Like I was starting to spell a word and I kind of got stuck in the middle. And so part of the methodology is learning how to cope with that. There is one thing I'll mention is there are not a lot of studies because there's not a lot of people who've been through this, and there's nobody to fund a $1 million study, at this point. However, everybody who's gone through this has come out with at least some improvement in their ability to communicate, and the vast majority with an enormous increase in their ability to communicate. And so the one study that is really interesting was an eye tracking study, because one of the criticism was, well, they're not really pointing to the letters, you're kind of pointing to the letters for them. And in the very early stages, it is almost like that. But what happens very quickly is they graduate to where they're pointing to the letters. And there was an eye tracking study that was published in Nature magazine where they were looking at where's the eye going. And what they found was that the eye is going to the letter well before the hand ever goes to the letter. And so that really just affirmed that, yes, this is real. Yes, they are not being directed to point to certain letters. They're doing it of their own volition. So it's really fascinating, and I'm just hopeful that we can get this pilot program through, because again, it's kind of a modest start, but it's the foot in the door. It's kind of saying let's give these people a fighting chance and give them something to start to work with, so that this can grow and it can really change people's lives.
We've been talking, and I'm kind of getting the feeling that most of the folks that have gone through this are, in the teenage years and up. How early do you think this program, or how early has this program been tried?
I don't know. You are correct that most, I think, are in the teenage years and up. I know of people who are in their 30s who've done it. My bill actually would not necessarily help them. I would like it to, but I have to start somewhere. And I feel that the best place to start is to get it into the schools. Because if we can get it into the schools, then we can start to grow it and make it available on a wider scale.
I think that would be an absolute miracle. Or obviously not all types of autism are going to be helped by this, right? These are going to be certain motor skills types autism. Like my son, he doesn't have a problem with motor skills, at his age. I mean, he's 22. He works independently. We talked last week. He works at Walmart. And he communicates, right? He has more of a social.
He's very
type
articulate,
issue.
actually.
Yeah. But for these specific types of disabilities where there's an inability to communicate, but they're there, and we know they're there, right? Because I've seen it with, I had an uncle who had ALS, right? Perfectly normal person for his entire life, but in the last 3 years it was like ALS hits you hard and it hits you fast, And so the last few times I saw him, he's completely unable to communicate, and we find ourselves speaking to someone like that, even though we know that they were perfectly normal 3 years ago.
Right.
We find ourselves talking to them in a manner that is kind of talking down, right?
Yes.
And it's unfortunate that that's what human nature does. But if we get these folks communicating at an early age, if we're able to unlock that early, grammar school, middle school, just imagine how much more productive. I mean, it's an amazing thing to think about. We've only got a couple seconds.
Okay. Spellersthemovie.com. Spellersthemovie.com if people want to learn more about that.
Awesome. All right. We will see you. No, we won't see you next week. We're going to take Thanksgiving off, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. JP should be back. That was it.